Hi, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to talk about the books I read in the first half of March, which included all school time. So probably the half for the end of March is going to be a little bit longer. And if my voice sounds a little bit off, it's probably because I have a little bit of a cold, but I'm feeling okay. So first off, we have A Song of Wraiths and Ruin. So this was the last book, besides Permission to Feel, that I had left on my TBR for February that I just didn't quite get to. I didn't enjoy it that much. I talked about this in a reading blog. At first, I was intrigued enough to keep reading. The writing flows easily, although the first chapter has a lot of info dumping in it, but not too much to put me off it entirely. And most of that info dumping did stop after the first chapter. Alternating between Malik's perspective and Karina's perspective, I think was necessary so you didn't get burned out with the trauma that each of these characters has experienced, especially Malik. However, the middle part lulls. It lulls big time, and it's going back and forth, and some of the things that they do don't make a lot of sense. So there's a scene where Malik and Karina go into this, there's a term for it. It's similar to Egyptian history where they would bury different things with the rulers. Necropolis, that's what it is. A city of death. It supposedly is something that she was able to go to with her mother, but she seems completely taken aback by that. And it didn't make any sense because I thought she was going the same place when this started. So the whole middle part doesn't make a lot of sense. And then in the last third, there's so much new magic added, new things that seem impossible, things that don't make a lot of sense, and motivations for characters that don't make a lot of sense. It just was like, wait, I don't get this. And at the same time, we're supposed to be rooting for Malik and Karina as a couple. I never saw any hint of romance between them, except for when it was told to me occasionally. So I will not be continuing with this series. Speaking of series, the next book that I completed in the month of, I almost said November, it's March. Shows you where my brain is. The next book that I finished was Magnus Chase and the Ship of the Dead. So it's Magnus Chase and the Gods of Asgard, and then the Ship of the Dead. So this is the conclusion to the Magnus Chase trilogy. And while I did not love it quite as much as the middle book, I still really enjoyed it. Ended up giving this 4.5 stars, which was the same rating as the other one. I guess I liked different things in different ways. I really appreciated the relationship between Alex and Magnus in this. I thought that was handled really well, and I thought it made a lot of sense too. I love Alex as a character. Throughout this book, he is trying to stop the newly freed Loki from starting Ragnarok. And of course, if you're familiar with Marvel at all, these are things that come to mind. And obviously, whenever I think of Loki, I picture Tom Hiddleston. That's not quite the trickster god that you have in Magnus Chase. But I thought that the development of some of the other secondary characters, some of the other friends, was really good. Like TJ. I'm forgetting the names. There's so many names and I'm really not good at them. The development, I think, was needed by the time we got to this book. If there had been more books in the series, I know that we would have seen more about those characters. But I thought that Riordan did a really good job in wrapping up this series, but yet leaving the door open for more. So the first audiobook that I read in the month of March was Midnight in Washington by Schiff. And I really enjoyed it. I had just a little bit of trepidation going into this book because a lot of those events as they went on and were going on were really emotionally taxing. It's hard to say because obviously I wasn't directly involved in these events. I'm just a regular, ordinary South Carolina citizen. As someone really invested in the political process and as a historian who studies different things and sees the long-term implications, to see some of the things that the former president was doing were really bothersome. And especially seeing how people I knew were responding to that. And I thought that reading about it again, not this book itself, would bring up some of those uncomfortable feelings. And I didn't get that. And I realized a big part of that, and I mentioned this in a blog, but a big part of that was the fact that there is separation from a lot of these events, a separation in time. There's a new president. I think this would hit a lot differently if the election had gone differently. But I also appreciated Adam Schiff as a narrator. So he did the narration for the audiobook as well. He made a concerted effort to maintain a solid, even-keeled tone, not neutral, because he was a participant in all of these, and obviously he is going to take a side, but he kept a fairly even, measured, level head about him throughout all of these. The only time that the audiobook you could hear some of his emotion coming through was when he was making some of his closing arguments for the first impeachment, and he was talking about, he was giving the answer to a question that had been brought to him earlier, and that is, we know he's guilty, so why should we remove him? I really appreciated, I could tell in the audiobook that he was trying to say both even keeled, but also he feels so genuinely passionate about what he was saying, and that came through. I think this will become an excellent primary resource for historians coming back and studying this time period. I don't consider this a work of history. I consider this a primary resource because it is written by someone who was there when the events happened. And as someone who studies things like that, I really appreciated it for that. The next book that I finished in the month of March, I did not start in the month of March. I believe I started it at the beginning of February. But that is Translating Childhoods. So this is one of those books that I read each day. In my day in the life vlog, you will see that I was still reading it at that time. I did finish it shortly thereafter. Again, I am new to the whole tabbing thing. This is just the third book that I have done, but it has helped me slow down and really think about the text that I'm reading. I have not yet gone back to these tabs, but I hope that I will. This book is a more academic book than some of the others that I have read recently. This is published by Rutgers University Press, and it was the result of a study that the author, Marjorie Faulstitch Orellana, completed. She was an educator. She did research in both California and the Chicago area. She did a lot of interviews with different immigrant children who did translation for their parents, for their families, in their daily lives. And she analyzed how that affected their interactions with people in the world, both their family members, other adults, other people in their lives. And I found this a really fascinating take. And it definitely is a book that if you teach MLs, multilingual learners, you should pick up and read this book. On the same vein of books that I read a little bit every day, we have Suente de Silencio. I believe I actually started this at the end of 2021. It is a bigger book, so even reading a little bit every day, it did take me longer to get through. And this is one of the books in Spanish that I attempt to read every day. This is one of a first for me because I have not read this book in English yet first. However, it is on my TBR. It is something that I plan to purchase. I have read several books by Ruta Sepetys before, and she does not disappoint. Ruta Sepetys, as a young adult historical fiction writer, takes aspects of history that are either not talked about a lot, or the area, the time period is talked about a lot, but she subverts that and she talks about an aspect that you might not know. So like with the recent graphic novel of hers that I read, Between Shades of Grey, she takes the aspect of what happened to the Lithuanians under the Soviet Union during World War II. And because the Soviet Union was one of the allies, it's not talked about a lot. In one of my favorites by her, which is Salt to the Sea, she talks about one of the greatest maritime disasters that ever happened. And prior to reading that book, I had no idea that it happened. And that was the sinking of a ship that was taking civilians from areas that had been conquered by the Nazi Reich. And this was as the Reich was contracting, the ship sank. And it's talking about that and the different people that were getting on that boat and that were involved in that. And that's fascinating. In this book, she talks about 1950s Spain. And one of the things that people don't realize is the fascist leaders of World War II, Hitler and Mussolini. They cut their teeth on helping another fascist dictator come to power in Spain, and that was Francisco Franco. And unlike Mussolini and Hitler, Franco died a peaceful death. He ruled Spain with an iron fist for decades. And it wasn't until the 70s when he died peacefully of old age, unfortunately. So the Spanish Civil War is where, the other fascist leaders cut their teeth and were rebuilding their military. And there was a lot of fallout that happened for the people who fought on the quote-unquote Republican side and their children. And one of the main characters, Anna, is the child of parents who fought on the losing side. And then the other main character, Daniel, is the son of an American oil businessman who is coming to make a deal with Francisco Franco. So one of the other things that people don't talk about is the fact that Americans were involved with a dictator and they cut deals, good business deals, as long as it benefited them. And this book tells their story. I will save a further, more in-depth review of this book until I'm able to read it in English. And the reason that I want to save it is because English obviously is my first language. I'm skilled enough with Spanish to understand and get the power of this book. There's so many really gut-wrenching things that happen in here. There's a lot of characters in here that you learn about, and then when things started going down with Anna's brother and his friend, I couldn't believe what I was reading. But I want to save a full in-depth review of this book until I'm able to read it in English. Is a very powerful book. And Ruta Sepetys, the fact that she is not more highly lauded and has not won more prizes, that's a travesty. Next, in the first half of March, I read the book Return to the Willows by Jacqueline Kelly. I can read sometimes, this is a booktube channel after all. So Return to the Willows is supposed to be a sequel to Wind in the Willows, the children's classic by Kenneth Grahame. And I have read Wind in the Willows, but I don't even remember when. Probably around the time that I added this sequel to it. I don't know if you can call it a sequel if it was written after the original author's death and not like with any permission or anything. I don't know the details of it, but apparently different sequels have been written. I'm not a children's book reader. I have become more familiar with this type of story and reading it and evaluating it, even thinking as a child, or looking at it with the lens of a child is going to read this, or this is going to be read to a child. The reading level of the text seems way too high for upper elementary, lower middle grade, which is what this seems to be aimed at. Most young adults aren't going to go for all the simplistic animals here. Adults aren't going to go for it. But the text and it just seemed very posh and British, but the author's American. I don't know how that goes. The illustrations are gorgeous. I love the illustrations in here. Very well done. The characters seem to fit with what I remember of the original characters in Wind in the Willow. This book is not necessary. It's too big. It's too advanced for its target audience. 2.5 stars from me, but hey, it's another book off my giant TBR. So the next book that I read in the month of March, I actually started and finished on one day, and that is Hood Feminism by Mikki Kendall. This is the March pick for Jess Owens' Community Read. I decided to start it on Saturday the 12th because Jess and Angela from Literature Science Alliance, who co-hosts the live show, were having reading sprints. And so it was fairly easy to start and finish in one day because it is so short. I really appreciated the approach that Mikki Kendall took to all of these different topics that she talked about throughout the book. It read like a series of essays or chapters specifically about different topics. So there's things on hunger, on education, on, I love the title of one of the chapters, Is Raining White Supremacy? Something like that. So it's deep, but it's not deep. But I will say, I loved her writing so much, and I so wish that I had a physical copy of my own to annotate, because this is a library book. reading through, I'm like, oh, I want to mark that, I want to remember that, I want to annotate this. But I didn't because, you know, it's a library book and I cannot wait for the live show to discuss this. The next audiobook that I completed, and see, I'm grinning from ear to ear already because I'm so excited about it, is The Final Empire, the first book of the Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. So I mentioned in a reading vlog when I first started reading it that I already loved it, and last night just cemented that. So I listened to the last 2 hours of it, about 100 pages because I listened at 2 times speed, and when certain things happened, I was cross-stitching because that's what I do when I listen to audiobooks, and I just stopped and I went, wait, what? What just happened? And like I couldn't look away even though I wasn't looking at it. In the first book, you're set up in a place where the Chosen One failed. They are living in a very dystopian-like fantasy world. So it's not our world dystopian, but it's what would happen if the Chosen One failed and evil won. And you have the Lord Ruler ruling, and he uses all sorts of things at his disposal to oppress basically everyone. You have 2 basic groups of people. You have the Ska, who are the majority of the population, but they're peasants and they're kept in complete slavery, servitude, whatever words you want to use. And then you have the noblemen. The noblemen have the ability to practice allomancy, and some Ska have that ability if they're in their heritage. There's a mix between Ska and the nobleman, but the Lord Ruler has made a rule that if a nobleman slaves with a Ska woman, he has to kill her right away. So there's no half-breeds. But I mean, it doesn't work because you have Kelsier and you have Vin and you have other mistings. But the allomancy, you have Mistborn and you have Mistings. So allomancy is the burning of metals, and Mistings can burn 1 metal and have powers. Mistborns can burn all of the metals and have powers. And Kelsier and Vin are Mistborn, and then the rest of the crew that they have are Mistings. The setup is they're supposed to be taking on this job, and ostensibly it is to overthrow the Lord Ruler. It has all of these intricacies. It's very caper-esque, like this plot to overtake things. And so different things happen throughout the book that either go according to plan or go definitely not according to plan until you get to the end, and I'm going to leave that blank. But so that's the premise for the story. I loved it. I will say, is it perfect? No. I don't like the fact that Vin is the only female perspective that you get, period. I mean, you talk to some other noble women when Vin is playing her role. You also get reference to Mare, who is Kelsier's wife, who died before these events. But other than that, you really don't have many women, if any others, mentioned. One of the things at the end that I will just refer to in the vaguest terms. So you have 2 perspectives throughout the book. You have Kelsier's and you have Vin's. And then when things are revealed at the end, it made me think back to some of the perspectives that we got from one of the other characters. And I'm like, wait, I don't see how those jive. I don't see how that person was setting all of that up ahead of time. It seems like explanation after the fact, but it's hard to talk about because I can't say anything or it would reveal it. I'm so close to going full tier on the Kickstarter, but I've already purchased the UK editions of the trilogy because I do not, so probably next month or the end of this month, I'm going to be reading the second book in the trilogy, The Well of Ascension. I don't like this type of cover. For one, this seems too busy, but the traditional fantasy covers, I just don't like. But the UK covers, wherever I put it, phenomenal. So I purchased that from Abe Books. I don't know when that's gonna get here, but probably I'll be reading that version of The Hero of Ages, and I've heard that that is the best way to end a series. So this turned into wrap up and like vlog update, but that's Mistborn, and I just finished that, and I'm super excited. I want to read all the Brandon Sanderson books now. So the last book that I read in the first half of March is Redemptor. Now, because it is the second book in a duology, I can't talk a lot about the synopsis without giving away spoilers. I felt really nervous before going into this because I loved Raybearer so much. I still prefer Raybearer to Redemptor. Not that this is a bad book. This book needed to come. This book needed to happen to really tie everything off that Jordan Ifueko set up. And one of the things that she mentions in the author's note, which I glanced at, is that she spent, so Raybearer was her debut novel, and she said she spent like 10 years working on Raybearer, and you can tell. She went right into Redemptor, and so it didn't have those 10 years of growing and percolating and developing. Not that that makes it a bad book, because authors write really good books really quickly. It just had a different feel to it. And I imagine for any author, their debut novel, especially one that they spend so much time working on, it's gonna feel a lot more special, like their firstborn, etc. But she still did such an amazing job with the characters in here. Tarasai's journey throughout this book felt 100% necessary. There was one character that gets brought in, and I can't say why because, you know, spoilers for Raybearer, but there's one character that gets brought in, and he's supposed to be this engaging, I'm trying to avoid spoilers, but anyway, he's supposed to be a character that you adore and you root for, but he's also conflicted. And there's an aspect of his characterization that gets revealed right towards the end of the book that I just felt like, that feels really weird. I don't 100% agree necessarily with that arc. It makes sense. It just wouldn't have been my preference, but it makes a lot of sense. Ultimately, the journey that Tarasai goes on through both of these books, perfect. She had to have both of these books because her journey in Raybearer set her up for completing her journey in Redemptor. And she definitely, by she I mean Tarasai, she definitely needed this to have a full, complete arc. I think this was an excellently wrapped up duology. There you have it. There are the, I don't even know how many books, I believe 10 books that I read in the first half of the month of March. I had a lot of pretty good reads. No standouts yet except for Mistborn. Setting up the stage for spring break and hopefully lots of books getting read because I have a whole week off and I want to read a lot of books. So probably part 2 of my March wrap up will be longer than part 1.